Actually, I should review this really quick. What, broadly speaking, do each of the lobes do? So, start with occipital. That's where I usually start. Vision. Temporal is auditory, so hearing. And I'll call it a more official term, olfaction instead of smell. That would be our terminology. And then parietal lobe, somatosensory, so touch, consciously aware. Touch is going to include pain, temperature, pressure, things like that. And then, let me skip to the insula, get to the exciting one last. The insula deep inside there, I'm fine if you just know taste, that's fine. There's some other complicated, interesting things involving emotion, but there's other parts as well besides the cerebrum. So I'm just going to leave it simple for now. And then frontal lobe is going to be our somatic motor. So that's going to be voluntary motor, unlike our autonomic motor that we'll talk about later in the term. It also is going to have problem solving or planning. That is in fact an S in whatever personality is. I feel like we know what it is, and it's just sort of hard to define sometimes, but that's all frontal lobe. So remember, Phineas Gage, he got a giant pole through his frontal lobe. Big change in his ability to problem solve, plan, control his emotions. His personality became very different. Okay, so that was a quick review. This is complicated at first glance, and truthfully, I'm not going to ask you to label something this complicated. If you were able to label those lobes and tell me generally what the function is, on these lobes, you're doing great. I wanted to show you this because it's really interesting. And also, actually, there is one thing you do need to know. We'll start with what you do need to know. So hopefully you remember the central sulcus, the one sulcus I really want you to know. I think in lab you also have the lateral sulcus. So those two, fairly easy. And then we had gyri. So a gyrus is one of these ridges, and we have this one and this one. Hopefully you remember the one in the anterior would be the pre-central gyrus, and the one in the posterior is the post-central. What do they do? Talk about it more in a bit, but basically motor and sensory. I'll talk about it more just a bit. I wanted to look at the other lobes, and this is not something I'm going to ask you, but I think it's really interesting, so I wanted to point it out. So let's just start here in the occipital lobe. So we have what's called the primary visual cortex, which is the most posterior back here. And then this other part of the occipital lobe called the visual association area. So what's the difference between those two? So in your primary visual cortex here, you are going to process information about the actual image. So think of this as the way, say a computer would analyze a set of pixels, right? You're going to look for, I don't know, contrasting colors and shape, contrast, say light, dark, color, shape, etc. Just really the nitty gritty of that image itself. But what that image is actually processed in the visual association area. So for instance, I'm looking at an apple, and that this area, the primary visual cortex, is going to see that it's red and it's of a particular shape. And it's got maybe stem coming out the top. It's got some line coming out of the top. We call it a stem. Great. So you've got all the aspects of the actual visual image. And then here in the association area, you are going to figure out that that is an apple. You are going to assign those colors, contrast, shapes to a particular thing that you know. So what that means, though, is your association area is built up during your lifetime, because when you're born, you haven't seen anything yet. And there are people around you that are going to guide you through life and tell you what an apple is and what it looks like. You're going to see something and they're going to tell you, that's a golf ball, or whatever it is. And so you build up an association area, because when you think about it, everything you encounter in this world, to figure out what it is, whether it's something you're hearing, seeing, whatever, you're going to have to draw on past experience to figure out what's going on, which means learning new things, like anatomy, can be tough. But it also means that if we make like analogies and metaphors for things you might already know, then it could be easier to understand things that are new, like novel to you. So you are building up your visual association area by being in this class, because we're doing a lot of visual things. So the same kind of pattern you would see in the other lobes as well, all these sensory lobes. So for instance, let's start with parietal. We'll just do the postcentral gyrus. So that's the primary somatosensory cortex. That's where you're going to process, say, this is soft, something soft, and that you're touching. And then in your association area, just behind it, so color in the association area just behind it here, that's when you're going to figure out what it is. You're going to be like, okay, so it's something soft and, oh, maybe warm. And then in your association area, you draw on past experience and figure out that you're petting a dog. And it might not always be a nice thing. It could be a painful thing, like burning your hand on a hot stove. So you're like, well, I felt this before. You feel burning sensation in your primary area. And then your association area is going to tell you that's because your hands, it's a stove. And stoves are hot because you've known that from past experience. And so same with hearing and smell. So really interesting stuff. Also, other thing I want to point out, and I want you to be able to name these areas, but you don't have to find them on a brain. This area right here, there it is. I was like, where's the words for it? Motor speech, sometimes called Broca's area. I learned it as Broca's area, and Wernicke's named after a French person and a man, of course. It's true though. Let's be honest. Broca's area, a French person discovered, and Wernicke's, it's a German person did. And they had patients with brain damage, and they weren't able to do certain things relating to language specifically. And so they concluded that these two areas are where you have language. And that's not strictly true, but it is true that these two areas are absolutely vital to language. So motor speech is actually production of words, and actually that would include writing as well. So making language, right? Producing language. So hence motor speech, it is a motor activity. Even if, let's say you're deaf and you don't speak spoken language, you are still using body parts, motor, to communicate, or if you're writing or typing. So this is a motor activity. Of course, talking, you're going to use your tongue and your lips and your larynx, your vocal cords, and that's all muscle movement. So that's production. And then here, I'll do this one in red. Wernicke's area. That is comprehension. So you notice it overlaps with auditory. And of course, if you were deaf, then probably your visual system would have taken over that area anyway. So it's comprehension. It's a weird looking end, sorry. Comprehension of either spoken, written, or gestural language, whatever the case may be. So you understand what's being said. So it's actually two different areas, which is fascinating for making language versus listening or reading. Or understanding language. So say if somebody had an injury here to the motor speech, they would be able to understand what you're saying, but they wouldn't be able to respond. And then this is kind of weird, vice versa. If this area is gone, they can produce language, but it is kind of nonsensical and they don't understand what you say you ask for something simple, you're doing an exam, and you ask them to, I don't know, pick up the apple from a group of items that they have sitting in front of them. They're not going to understand that word apple, but they can talk, and it's often nonsensical in some ways. I think that they have an idea of what they want to express, and they have the motor skills to do it, but something gets lost in there. So all I want you to know is the name of these two areas, motor speech and Wernicke's. One of them we are going to name after someone because that's the alternative your book gave you. And then I want you to know what they do. So motor speech would be production of language, and Wernicke's area is comprehension of language.